Hey, um, wow. Okay, so what a play to finish out the semester on. I liked it surprisingly. So, as always, I looked up a summary of it online before I read it because that just kind of helps me take in the plot a little bit easier. And at least the one that I looked up, it was very vague with the actual plot of the story. And it just kind of talked about the symbolism and the different characters and what they meant. So yeah, I went in this a lot more blind than normal, and so only knowing that the main character was Abraham Lincoln, but what wasn't and didn't actually have an identity, and it was very stylized and abstract. I was like, oh, great, here we go. But I liked it. I liked it a lot. It was short but dense, and very complex, as you said. Um, so what is that great whole of history? Also, uh, what do you think Parks has to say about the narrative history? Why do you think this play came out of the 90s? I'm going to answer all of those, hopefully, in just this one chunk of discussion, um, because I think talking about this answers a lot of these questions. So, in 1991, the LA riots occurred. So, what happened? This African American man was caught up in a police chase. He was being chased by the cops, and when they eventually caught up with him, they severely beat him and shot him multiple times with a taser gun. Doesn't this sound familiar? But no, it was in 1991. So what happened? Someone caught it on videotape. And this was one of the first instances of someone actually catching video evidence of a black man being mistreated by white cops. So, when this inevitably went to court, guess who walked away scot-free? Yeah, I don't even have to say it. So whenever that happened and the video evidence circulated, riots happened for like 4 days. Like there was like $1 billion in damages done. People died. Thousands of people were injured. And what came of it? A settlement. The dude got like $1 million. Like, okay, well, whatever. And guess what happened to the cops? Nothing happened to two of them, and then the other two were stripped of their honors and were forced to retire. Oh, dang. Gee whiz. What a bummer. So, yeah, so that happened in 1991. This play was written in 1993. So this play is fresh out of that event. And I think it's extremely obvious to see when you think about the gunshots and about the entire theme of the play in general. Which brings me back to the question, what is the great whole of history? So from what I perceived and from what I gathered from other sources in the text, the great whole of history is that big old gaping hole that we have in history of minority groups, more specifically of the African American group. Because who wrote all of our history books? Who wrote down and documented American history? Straight white men. Mm-hmm. So we really don't have any accurate information on the true day-to-day lives of minority groups. Um, so yeah. So in saying all of that, I think the events that happened before the writing of this play is absolutely evident in the play whenever you bring all of this together. And it is absolutely a play that comes out of the 90s, and and I think that's where we get the purpose of the echoes and the gunshots. When you think of it in terms of all of the black men and women who have been attacked, beaten, or killed by cops in the past, or just figures of power and authority in the past, but has never been documented. Now it's documented all the time. Nothing is changing. No one is doing anything about it, but it's documented now. Think of all of the lives, all of the human beings who have just died, and we have no documentation of it. And I think that's where this idea of this whole of history is coming from. At least that's what I'm perceiving it as. Um, yeah. And so thinking of that, when I think of these gunshots, and every time that gunshot sounds, and there's multiple in the play, how staggering is that? If you think of it representative of one gunshot equals 100,000 minority lives that have been affected and have been completely written out of history. It's this place suddenly becomes way more heavy. I don't know if that was Park's intention, but that's at least how I perceived it. And I think she wrote it to be that way. She wrote it to where you put what you want into the story, because she made the main character without an identity. So yeah. So I already answered some of these questions. So who is the lesser known versus the greater known? Well, the way I perceived it, the greater known is the people we know about in history. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, all the white people. And then the lesser known are all of those we don't know anything about. You look at Native American groups, we hear all the time about how white people did this to them and white people did that to them. Do we have any documentation of actual, of their perception of what happened, of all the atrocities that happened to them, or slavery in America? Yes, there's evidence out there of documentation that they were able to jot down, but it's nothing compared to the textbooks and articles and all the other stuff that we have of perceptions of white men, So yeah, sorry. So that, I think, is the lesser known versus the greater known. Obviously, it's still the main character in the play versus, Abraham Lincoln, but that's the more deeper, complex idea. Like I said, oh my god, this play is so deep and, so rich in subtext. So yeah. So what's the difference in forefathers and faux fathers? Well, so also that got real confusing really fast. I tend to put words in whenever I think I know what it means, and so I kept getting them switched around in my brain. But what I found that to be, you think about it, we hear the term our forefathers of America, our founding forefathers. This country was not just founded by white men. It was formed on the backs of Native Americans and African Americans and Mexican Americans, and you're noticing a theme here. I'm not saying white men had nothing to do with it. They had everything to do with it. But they dominated those groups, and then they wrote history about them, not about the minority groups, obviously. So yeah, I think, at least for me, that's what I perceived, this idea of forefathers versus faux fathers, F-A-U-X. So yeah. What do you think Parks has to say about the narrative of history? Well, I think we already covered that. Yeah. So what does this play say about how we remember history? Well, that we remember those in power, we remember the white men, we remember all of those people who had the resources and the time and the money to document their history. We don't know anything about the minority groups compared to what we know about the majority. Which I think is also interesting because the main character in the play, he documents his actions throughout, and I think that says something. My people didn't get to document all of the things that happened to them, so I'm gonna make sure I do it. Again, I need to just say I may be taking this a completely different direction than what it's meant to be. This is at least just what I perceived. Because it is very stylized, and I think she did write it in such a way that you can put your own thoughts and your own perceptions into it, because it is so abstract and stylized. So yeah, just wanted to give that disclaimer. So yeah, that's what I perceived anyway. What this play makes us think about how we remember history, or one group's history. So what is the representation versus reality? There's this really interesting contrast in the play between this idea of what's happening right now and this weird skewed timeline that is in the play versus the theater. Like the theater where Abraham Lincoln was shot, and this weird continuous reenactment, this theatrical reenactment. I think it's again talking about how, we have what some people said happened, and then we have what actually happened. Again, going back to the LA riots, we have what the cops said, we have what people in power said to make themselves feel better and look better, versus the actual documentation of what happened. So yeah, that's what I perceived that to be, is this idea of what we paint the world to look like versus the ugly truth of what it actually is. Um, so yeah, um, I had to really kind of cut this down. I made a couple videos when they were like 15, 16 minutes long, so I had to kind of cut it down a little bit. But yeah, I love this play. I thought it was great. I thought it was a great one to go out on. My God, this is my last required play to read. Dangle dangle. Um, yeah, I enjoyed it. I think it absolutely is in line with the plays that we've been reading, you know, regarding discrimination and lack of recognition for minority groups. Yeah. So that's it.